Sermon of the Week, Bargain, based on the book First Chronicles. Colonel, how goes it out there? The colonel stared at the ground, then looked up at his commander and shook his head. Better send in the reserves. I'm not sure even they can turn the tide, but might as well try, the commander said. I think if we concentrate on their left flank, we can turn them into that little draw. There we can squeeze them from the right and left. Then if you send in the reserves, we should be able to finally win this thing, the colonel said, little confidence emanating from his voice. Okay, let's try it, but if you don't make any progress in the next couple hours, I'll keep you posted, General, the colonel said as he mounted his huge black steed. The general called to him, What's holding you up? Usually we just roll over these foes like nothing. They got another one of those big guys set firmly on their far left flank, and he is single-handedly killing our soldiers right and left. The commander shook his head and waved his colonel toward the battlefield. Another one, he said aloud. What's that, sir? His adjutant asked. Nothing. He stared at the floor in disbelief. No, is Jonathan here, or is he out in the front lines? I'll check, sir. The adjutant saluted and marched away. A couple of hours passed. The commander had nodded off, but was awakened by horse hoofs. His colonel raced toward the command tent, jumped down from his horse, and came up to his commander. He was out of breath. Sir, things are not any better. This big guy is killing us, literally. If we don't take him out, we will have to withdraw. Only a couple hours of daylight left, the colonel said. What happened to your arm? Blood was running down the colonel's left arm in a steady, meandering stream. Oh, just a flesh wound. The big guy's spear just grazed me. That spear is as big as a weaver's beam. Must be 12 feet long and weighed 200 pounds. They got it razor sharp. And our arrows just bounce off the guy's armor. I don't know. What's this? The third battle with these guys in 3 months? Yes, sir, the adjutant said. At Gezer you were victorious. Only when Sabachai took out the giant son Scipii. Then again a month later we marched to victory. Only when Elhanan took out the giant's brother Lami. Sir, the adjutant said. The commander stood and slammed his hand down hard on the table. How many brothers and sons did that crazy giant have? Every time I turn around, another one stands up to challenge me. He slammed his hand down even harder on the table, wincing as he did so. I'm sick and tired of these ogres coming after me. Can't anyone do something? He sat back in a state of weariness. Sir, you sent for me? A tall, slender soldier said. Ah, yes, my good friend Jonathan. Now your father, there was a soldier. If he was here, this battle would already be over. All in the commander's company stared at the ground. Sir, what orders do you have for me? Jonathan said. Do you have any ideas as to how we can take out this giant on the opponent's left flank? He's at least 10 feet tall and wields a 12-foot spear. Our boys just can't get close enough. As long as he stands there, we can't win this thing, the colonel said. Oh, and our arrows just bounce off his armor like it was a city wall. Well, what do you think? I know your father could have taken him out. You are your father's son, but I'm not, so... I'll get him, Jonathan said. All stared at him skeptically. I'm afraid it will take more than 5 smooth stones, the commander said sarcastically. No worries, I'll get him. Just take me to him. How are you? The colonel said. The commander raised his now aching left hand and said, Go get him for me, for Israel, for the living God. I will, sir, Jonathan said, saluting. The colonel stared at his commander, but motioned for his horse and one for Private Jonathan. The two mounted and raced toward Israel's far right flank. Once there, they dismounted, and the colonel pointed to the massive soldier standing at the far left flank of the enemy army. He's huge, Jonathan said, his mouth agape. He then turned to stare at his surroundings. Soldiers were being brought in on stretchers in a steady stream to the field hospital nearby. What's the highest point around here? He asked the colonel. The colonel thought a moment and then said, Probably that cliff off to the right. No, that's too far away, Jonathan said. There's a little apple orchard about 50 yards over there to our right, the colonel's captain interjected. Any soldiers there? Not that we know of, no reason to be. That giant anchors their flank. That'll do, Jonathan said, and he walked rapidly away to the right. He worked his way to the end of his own army's flank, then began crawling. He was unnoticed by the enemy and finally worked his way to the little orchard. There were only about 10 trees, but some were full of apples. As he watched the army slogging it out, he took an apple and began chomping down on it. It was the juiciest apple he'd ever eaten. Well, maybe. He then opened his waistcoat and began to remove his belt. It was about 6 feet long, but had a small net attached to each end. He searched around to find a couple of stones to put in each net, but found nothing but weeds and grass. Finally, he hit on it. He searched and found the 2 largest apples he could find. He put one in each net and then began to swing his makeshift bolo over his head. The apples were about a half-pound each, and as he swung, he squinted to gauge the weight and distance to his target. The giant had sat down and was eating an apple of all things himself. Jonathan waited patiently, and finally, after about 15 minutes, the giant stood and began to bellow and wield his massive sword again, completely intimidating what was left of the Israeli army. To be successful, he needed the giant to stand relatively still. He sent up a silent prayer to his God. The giant continued to bellow and swing his massive sword. Jonathan kept twirling his makeshift bolo. Faster and faster he swung it, and just at the right moment he let it fly, high and straight and true. The commander had taken out his field glasses. He stared down at his incompetent army and began easing it farther to the right. He finally focused on the giant known as Goliath II. He became despondent as he watched the used soldiers swing his sword and his own Israeli army cowering and slowly retreating. He realized this Goliath of Gath, Goliath II, was even bigger than his father. He watched in awe and almost admiration as the giant single-handedly was cutting down his men by the hundreds. Suddenly, as he stared through his glass, he saw the huge soldier grab at his neck. To the commander's amazement, the giant soldier kept grabbing at his neck, seemingly trying to pull something away. The commander noticed the giant had a thumb and not 4, but 5 fingers. He did a double take. Within a minute or so, the giant slumped to his knees, and within another minute collapsed in a massive heap on the battlefield, his hands clutching at his neck. Just as suddenly, the commander's own army began pushing the enemy back up the hill to the north, and the rout was on. Good fortune is very common in many parts of the world. I'm sure all of you have experienced good fortune at one time or another, or maybe many times. One can work for good fortune, and often the harder one works, the greater the good fortune. But many times good fortune comes to us unexpectedly. We generally consider it to be received by accident, or maybe we consider it fate or destiny. The person who wins the lottery of millions of dollars buys a $2 ticket. But if he or she wins, they almost always call it luck. But is it luck, or is it something else? The evolutionist considers the universe and its environs as coming into being by luck or chance, as they call it. Mathematicians calculate the odds of this universe actually coming into being as almost impossible. But the evolutionists have stuck to their guns for more than 150 years and have convinced over half of humanity that their theories are correct. For the 6,000 years of recorded history, all but a few have believed that man is in control. Oh, they all have gods of one sort or another to consult, but when push comes to shove, man himself fully believes he is in control of himself, many of those around them, and the world. Even today, man who cannot fly is making preparations to gain control of nearby moons and planets. Once done, he will move out from his own solar system to his galaxy, the Milky Way. Once gaining control of this galaxy, he will move on to others and eventually try to gain control of the whole universe. Man realizes his own Earth does not contain the resources to sustain life past another century or two, so he will gather resources from other planets and stars to maintain life. Sound familiar? The literature of science fiction proposes this activity repeatedly, and man buys into it lock, stock, and barrel. Not just man, but entire governments are preparing for their future. Man firmly believes that he will succeed. Governments are petitioning off the moon and Mars as we speak. However, just as on Earth, man is and will remain a warmonger no matter where he is. Cain and Abel could not get along. Their parents were also at odds in Eden. Down through recorded history, man has been in a constant state of war. and today is no different. Cold, hot, lukewarm, man is a soldier, and his duty is to fight for something, some cause. He has proven beyond a shadow of any doubt that he is not a man of peace. The most famous Kentucky racehorse was aptly named Man of War. If I have the opportunity, the question I want to ask God is this: why did you create man in the first place? The Bible says it is for God's pleasure, but man has caused God unimaginable grief. Man even killed a part of God, yet God still wants to preserve his men of war. The corollary question is, why did he create angels? Arguably, they have created even more grief for God than man, and God, by definition, knew all this would happen. My humble answer is that God was lonely, but of course that will not be his answer. One of my favorite stories in history is The Agony and the Ecstasy. Irving Stone's historical novel relates Michelangelo's 4-year task of painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. A great movie based on the book came out in 1965. Charlton Heston played Michelangelo, and Rex Harrison played Pope Julius II. It's one of my favorites. His patron was Pope Julius II, and the painting was done from 1508 to 1512. It's interesting to note that only 5 years later, Martin Luther kicked off the Reformation in Wittenberg, Germany. The story is two great egos. Michelangelo and Julius II were at constant odds. Julius was fighting a war of survival during this time, and Michelangelo battled fatigue, health problems, jealousy, constant scrutiny, and his own talent. But in 1512, everything smoothed out. Julius secured the Papal States as a permanent governmental entity, and the world lauded Michelangelo's work as unmatched in all history. Near the end of the movie, the conversation between Michelangelo and Julius are fascinating. Their conclusion is that neither could have accomplished what he did by himself. They conclude that there is a God. And you no doubt know the general that opened our story is none other than King David, the second king of Israel. David started out as a shepherd boy, but by some fortune he was able to kill a bear with his own bare hands. Just as Davy Crockett grinned a bear to death and became famous, so David rode his exploits to fame. He landed in the court of the king of Israel, Saul. Saul did not want to be a king and remained dysfunctional throughout his reign. He was wildly jealous of David and kept David in constant peril. However, the Bible tells us David escaped from Saul's clutches time after time after time. This, among other things, drove Saul to madness. When Saul passed away, David was proclaimed king. He was a good king and expanded Israel's lands and wealth in exponential fashion. His biggest claim to fame was slaying the Philistine giant Goliath of Gath while Saul was still king. Now, when David was king, the relatives of Goliath wanted revenge and marched on David's army. This short story is found in 1 Chronicles 20 and verse 8. I believe David had never been defeated in battle, but this fact did not deter the Philistines. Goliath's brother Lahmi, Lahmi, led his giants into battle. It was said his spear was the size of a weaver's beam, but David and his men took down Lahmi's army. This only further incensed the Philistines, and they led their army back into battle again, this time with Goliath's son. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 fingers on each foot, but this extra power was no match for King David's finely tuned and experienced army. David sat back in his kingly robes and realized he was unbeatable. He had defeated every foe that he could remember, and his face shone with pride as he stared over the now quiet battlefield. He was the greatest king who ever lived, and his army was the greatest to have ever set foot on a battlefield. He called for one of his wives and ordered a feast to be set up. The celebrating lasted far into the night. When he awoke the next morning, he immediately called for his colonel Joab. Joab had a bad hangover, but he staggered into David's court and attempted to stand at attention. David came down from his throne and put his arm around his colonel, who nearly sagged to the ground. My good man, congratulations. You've engineered our final victory. There is nothing left to conquer. Joab nodded. There's Egypt, and he tried to say Assyria, but David cut him off. They'll knuckle under to any of our demands. We've done it. You have done it. I have done it. We are the number one army on the entire planet. There's nowhere to go but up, Joab nodded. What does number one do? What is his task? How does number one stay number one? Joab shook his head. Organization. That's what we do. Our army is scattered about and lacks organization. Despite this, we cannot be defeated. I think we need to take a census of our armed forces so that we can organize even better. That way, no one will even dare to attack us. I don't think that's such a good idea, Joab said in his grainy hangover voice. Then we can pay them properly and tax them accordingly. David had not heard Joab, and Joab realized from past experience that to argue with David was a futile task. He nodded, turned, and headed for his command center to institute the massive undertaking. 1 Chronicles 21 puts a unique twist on this story. Verse 1. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. Moving on to verse 7. And God was displeased with this thing, therefore he smote Israel. First of all, were God and Satan on speaking terms? After all that had transpired since the beginning of the earth, some 3,000 years before, they apparently were, and no doubt still are. It is difficult for me to get around this idea, but the Bible refers to it repeatedly. My second question is, were Satan and David on speaking terms? The Bible infers repeatedly that David and God were, either directly or through prophets. So too were David and Satan. A most dangerous place to be, but 1 Chronicles puts it in black and white. The prophet Gad relays God's extreme displeasure to David to make up for his sin, and what sin was it? Of course, it's pride. This most heinous of sins, the one that brought down Satan and eventually the entire human race. The law of the universe is that for one of action, there must be an opposite and equal reaction. This law holds true for sin as well. For each sin committed, there must be payment. There must be reaction. God now demonstrates this law by offering David a penance or payment for his sin. He gives David 3 options for taking that census. Number 1, 3 years of famine. Number 2, 3 months of military defeats. Number 3, 3 days of the sword of the Lord, a plague on the land of Israel. David realized the gravity of his sin and that none of the choices provided was going to be a picnic. People were going to die, but David was shrewd enough to know that the famine could wipe out the whole nation. 3 months of military defeats would wipe out his entire army. The census had to be completed, and the army numbered 1.5 million soldiers at arms. 1 Chronicles 21:5. David surmised 3 days of a plague would be the least damage to Israel, and that the sword of God was the best bargain. There was no number 4, none of the above. Have you ever tried your hand at bargaining, maybe at a flea market or a car dealer or with your children? Are you a good bargainer? Some people have a great talent for negotiating. Our president is famous for bargaining. Now that he is president, the bargaining is much more difficult, but I pray he will be successful. The next question is likely to be answered in the affirmative by almost every human being. Did you ever bargain with God? And how did that come out? Maybe you decided to donate some money in order that he would let you be accepted at some university. Maybe you decided to quit swearing so that you could afford a new car. Maybe you decided to quit smoking and drinking for a while so you could deliver a perfectly healthy baby. Maybe you decided to stop seeing other women in order to win an election. Maybe I could go on and on. The classic one is seen in the movie Liar, Liar, where the attorney Jim Carrey couldn't lie, though he desperately wanted to. But one thing David and all of us come to realize is that we are not bargaining with God, we are bargaining with ourselves. We know what we should do. We all have a conscience. We all know right from wrong. Yet we use God as our crutch to justify our actions. David knew that overconfidence of an army would lead to disaster, complete and utter defeat. 1.5 million soldiers would eventually succumb to their enemies, the Philistines, Egypt, Assyria. They weren't going away. David knew that his God was the reason he had been successful. He believed fully in his God his whole life, and yet in a split second, he was ready to turn 180 degrees and believe that he, David, was responsible for his success. It took only the hint of a suggestion by the king of pride to turn David against his God. How often does the king of pride turn us away from our Creator? The atheist will say, "This is all bunk. There is no God." But if you've ever seen a television set, you know the evil and terror in this world. If there is evil by definition of the law of the universe, there must be good. Viewing the exploits of man for 6,000 years of recorded history, man is not the author of good. Back to David's choices. 3 years of famine would have killed several million Israelites, if not everyone. 3 months of military defeats would have killed all 1.5 million soldiers of the Israeli army. 3 days of pestilence did kill 70,000 Israeli citizens, but God in his mercy stopped the plague after 1 day. Mercy, you say? 70,000 deaths is not mercy in any way, shape, or form. True, but lest we forget, the exact same sin of pride committed first by Lucifer, then by Adam and Eve, has led and will lead to the deaths of 20 billion humans, and at least that number of angelic beings. What the world does not or cannot grasp is that God is not responsible for death. He didn't kill Abel. Before the flood, man was bent on his own self-destruction. God happened to find 8 humans willing to take the course of self-preservation. 8 out of how many billion? Our world got right back on the same track right after the flood and has come ever so close to eliminating humanity time and time again. What if Alexander the Great had lived 60 years? What if Charlemagne had not lived? What if Columbus had not discovered America? What if Cornwallis had won at Yorktown? What if Napoleon had met a heat wave in Moscow? What if Hitler had won the Battle of the Bulge? What if Kennedy would have pressed the red button? What if? God regrets every day promising to destroy his world with water a second time. He had to die in order to keep that promise. He is trying everything possible to preserve his precious human creations. But man meets him with new atrocities at every turn. And ladies and gentlemen, it is not going to stop. Man has proven to himself, his God, and everyone in the universe that he is not capable of escaping the addiction of sin. The end result, as we spoke earlier, is that the opposite and equal reaction. Sin requires payment. The universe exists because it has laws, it has order. When that order is broken, it will cease to exist. God alone seems to realize this and does everything he can to preserve it. The only answer man understands is to see that reaction firsthand. David was ready to turn and destroy his own massive army with overconfidence, with pride. Man will do the same. God knew a pat on the hand was not going to change David's mind. Only the sight of evil up close and personal would resonate with David. And David is said to be a man of great faith in his God. Just read the Psalms. There now comes a fascinating end to our story. David and all Israel watched 70,000 people. I repeat, 70,000 people suffer and die of this plague. Finally, David had had enough, and he called upon the Lord directly. 1 Chronicles 21:17. And David said unto God, Is it not that I commanded the people to be numbered? Even I it is that have sinned. David stood by and watched 70,000 people die in front of him before he finally decided to repent and make things right. The population of Newport Beach, California is about 70,000. It would be as if the mayor of Los Angeles watched all Newport Beach be destroyed by some army or catastrophe before he decided to do anything about it. Does this blow your mind? It sure does mine. God now withdraws his angel with the plague, but the damage is done. I'm not sure David got the message even then. Most certainly the world's not getting the message. Our world is and has been in chaos for over 6,000 years. Man blames an evil God or man blames Satan or poor little Eve, but man never blames himself for the irreversible mess our world is in. Excuse me. Yet if you honestly sit down, take stock, study history, study current events, study the psyche of man, I challenge you to draw any other conclusion than that we alone are responsible for this fine mess. The atheist says they don't believe in God because there is a hell where God burns people forever. The simple answer is that if God does not destroy the people who are and continue to promote evil, they will destroy those who wish to do good, and eventually they will destroy all life on earth. I say again, if there is evil, there has to be good. So what can I do as one little insignificant human? How can I have any impact on world chaos? How can I avoid evil? My friend, there's only one answer. Take a hard look at the one man who did defeat evil. The world watched as humanity and the angelic throng hung in the balance. Jesus was one step away, one kneel away, one bite away from ending all humanity. He was a hair's breadth from defeat. How did he overcome? How did he become a winner against the longest odds in human history? Read Matthew chapter 4. Jesus spent the first 30 years of his life preparing for 3 little questions. When the time came for his pop quiz or final test, he was ready. He knew exactly how to answer the 3 most difficult of life's questions, ones we all have to answer. The odds were stacked against him. The angels were taking all the money they could at 1,000 to 1 or better that Christ would fail. Gabriel's boys had hoped against hope that Jesus would somehow overcome those long odds. Lucifer's gang was supremely confident. They had won in Eden, and they would certainly win here. How did Jesus overcome such odds? How did he do it? When push came to shove, Jesus put his foot squarely down on the rock of his God. He didn't bargain with his God like David. He didn't bargain with Lucifer. If he did so, he knew he would lose, but there was never any doubt in Jesus' mind that he would answer every question right, that he would win. How did he do it? He embraced his God. It is written, he repeated over and over. It is written. It is written. It is written. To every question posed him, he used the word of God to give the right answer, and he walked off that mountain on that beautiful spring day with the biggest comeback win in all history.